and Laura for their help in honoring my grandmother and her family. Catherine Jordan, in your exhibit, An American Town in World War I. My grandmother had kept a scrapbook of her activities at the club she helped organize during World War I, named the Military Girls. Most of the members had a loved one serving in the military, either in training or overseas. On July 28, 2014, the 100th anniversary of the start of the Great War in Europe, I presented a copy of her scrapbook to Annie Murphy. And a few days later, I received an email from Ruth Ann Tomasetti. She was astonished to see that her grandmother, Helen Bowen, and great-aunts were in the club, too. Her great-aunt Alice was the president. Our grandmothers would be so happy to know that we made such a special connection and became friends 100 years later. And now Ruth Ann and I have our own new club called the Night Owls because we email at midnight. Much of the information I learned about the club was chronicled in my grandmother's scrapbook. The women socialized weekly to organize glad-to-get boxes for the soldiers, as well as organize fundraisers for the Red Cross. I learned the names of members through the luncheons they hosted, the names and ranks of soldiers through their thank you letters, and the facts about the war effort from the articles that my grandmother kept and from my own research. Members took turns hosting weekly meetings in their homes. The names of the soldiers were drawn from boxes assembled and plans made for fundraisers. Weekly dues were used to help with the costs. The women participated in parades, held plays, and organized dances. The meetings were followed by luncheons, usually decorated in red, white, and blue, and usually Denison decorations. We're lucky to have some of the direct descendants of our military girls here today. Mary Louise Seaver, there's Mary Louise, is the daughter of Agnes Harrington, who was a military girl. Betty Casella is here. She's the daughter of Frank Fair, who was one of our soldiers, and niece of Alice Fair. Grandniece or niece? Niece. And my cousin Philip Harrington, whose Uncle Phil was also Mary Louise's uncle, and he's his son. So we have some first generations. My Uncle Robert Jordan lives in Silver Spring, Maryland. Couldn't be with us, but he's with us in good wishes. So hopefully he'll see this online later. So you have the list of some of the soldiers. So I would like to introduce you to our military girls and the soldiers and our military girls. And then I'll start with Mary Jane Brogy Harrington, was my great-grandmother. She helped to host the luncheons at her house. She was born in Milford on January 22nd, 1860, 159 years ago, right before Lincoln became president and the Civil War started. Her parents, John and Mary Ann Collins Brogy, were Irish immigrants. She moved to Mendon, Mass. when her parents purchased West Hill Farm, which now is West Hill Dam, is right next to where their farm was. And I found her as a 5th grader in the 1870 census, so she did go to school. In her late teens, she moved to New York and worked with a family that lived over a store. And she met and married Michael Timothy Harrington, an immigrant from Kenmare County, Kerry, Ireland, who worked in the store. They had their first child, Ellen, in New York. And around 1886, they purchased land in Mendon at the top of the hill, just as you go from Hopedale into Mendon. And there's Harrington Street there now. And they had 9 more children there. Between 1910 and 1911, they sold their land to the Italian-speaking people of Milford, who had to walk to the mills, the Draper mills. And the land was developed for housing for the workers from the Draper mills. And they moved to 99 Franklin Street in Framingham. And this is where the military girls held a lot of their luncheons, the Harrington side. That house was across from the former Grace Church, where there's a bank. That would have been in the back parking lot, and it was torn down when they built the bank. So after they moved there, suddenly in 1914, Michael passed away. And Mary Jane had young children still at home. So she went into real estate and flipped houses. And now I know that's why I love fixer-upper. In her last years, she lived with her son, George Harrington, and his family on Granite Street, right near St. Bridget's Church, right here at up at the Center. And she died March 6, 1938 in my grandmother's home. Agnes Harrington was born July 12, 1895 in Mendon. She attended school in Mendon until the age of 17 when they moved to Framingham. She worked at Nantasket Beach in the summer with all her sisters. And after completing school, she worked for Wallace Nutting and became his only traveling saleswoman. So that was an interesting fact. Marguerite Harrington, they called Reedy, was born January 14, 1897, and she moved to Framingham when she was 15. After finishing school, she worked at the railroad station in South Station in Boston as a stenographer. And I'll tell you at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about each of them when they're finished. My grandmother, Cassie Harrington, was secretary of the military girls and keeper of the scrapbook. She was born February 9th, 1890 in Mendon, and she became Cassie when her sister couldn't say Kathy. She kept that name all her life. She graduated from Mendon High School in 1907, and a year later entered Framingham Normal School, which is Framingham College, a university. It was a 2-year teaching school. She graduated in 1910, and this is her pin that she's wearing above the little watch. During my senior week at Framingham, Framingham State in 1970, we spent time together when she attended her 60th class reunion. We walked around the campus together. When she student taught at the Mendon Primary School, so that's her class, student teaching. Her family was still in Mendon at the time, so she probably lived at home and was able to walk down and teach. And then she taught at the East School, which became known as the Shaw School, a one-room schoolhouse, grades K to 8, in the Berkshires in Windsor, Mass. And she lived with Mrs. Erling Shaw. It was called the Shaw School because it was on the Shaw farm, and she lived in the farmhouse with Mrs. Shaw. And this spring, my sister Peggy and I went out and we found the schoolhouse. It's got an addition on the back, and there's a young family that lives in it now. So it was really neat. We thought it was torn down, and we found out it was still there. From there, she went to the Plains School in Milford. And if you drive Route 16 from Holliston into Milford, this flat area where all the big buildings are, the shopping district kind of, that's the flat plains area of Milford. And her school was on Route 16, just past Route 85, and now there's a park with a stone there that says Plains School. She taught grade 3, I think it was, until she got married in 1920. The girls worked at the Rockland House in Nantasket Beach in the summers, and we actually have postcards from Agnes to my grandmother at the one-room schoolhouse saying, the dining room is emptying out, people are leaving, and it's time to go back to school. So that was right when my grandmother was starting to teach at the one-room schoolhouse. And this is my grandma and grandpa. Cassie met a dashing young man, William James Jordan, at St. Stephen's Church on Concord Street, Framingham. And that's the old St. Stephen's, if you can remember it. It's kind of neat to see it. When I was little, it felt like there were 100 steps going up. Their relationship became serious before he entered the war. This is Alice Fair, the president of the club. And Alice was born October 2nd, 1885. Alice and her siblings were the children of James and Catherine Brannigan Fair of Natick. We let them move to Framingham. It was a good thing. The census listed James as a teamster, which meant truck driver. The Fair family experienced several tragic and life-changing events over a period of 6 years. Sadly, their mother, Catherine, passed away in 1906 from typhoid fever, leaving 10 children from the ages of 2 to 23. James moved the family to Gilbert Street in Framingham, where the older children helped to raise the younger children. In 1908, it was another shock to the family when Alice's sister Catherine died suddenly of acute pulmonary edema. James did remarry Mary Forward, a native of Canada, and in September 1910, she had premature twin boys that only lived 3 weeks. And in 1912, she died of tuberculosis. So the family went through a lot. And through it all, the Fairs remained a hardworking and stalwart family in our community. Alice was a graduate of Framingham High School and finished 1 year of college. She worked as a stenographer at the Framingham Railroad Station, and she helped organize military girls, and the caption talks about her being their ardent knitter. It said Alice Harrington? Oh, it's Alice Fair.
That's a typo, my bad.
Oh, she did it right. Isobel Fair, Bradley, completed 4 years of high school and 1 year of college. She worked at Dennison Manufacturing Company with her older sister, Catherine, and must have missed her greatly when she passed away. Isobel married John Bradley on October 28, 1914, just after the start of World War I in Europe. And then we have Helen Fair, Mrs. Walter Bowen. Helen was born April 11, 1895. She also graduated from Framingham High School and Nurses Training School. And we know she worked as a nurse before her marriage to Walter Bowen on July 4th, 1915. Her marriage was presided over by Father John Heffernan at St. Stephen's Church. And Loretta Fair was born September 17th, 1897. She was only 9 when her mother died and grew up in the guidance of her older brothers and sisters. She graduated from Framingham High School and worked as a secretary. They were all members of the club. And we have Frank Fair. He was born on April 24th, 1892. He was 14 when his mother moved away and moved to Framingham with his family. According to his June 15th, 1917 draft registration, I love this, he stated he was a teamster for Washacum Ice Company, was 24 years old, short, stout, with blue eyes and light brown hair. In his thank you note we received from the military girls, he was listed as a Chief Wagoner, U.S. Company 11, 101st Mounted Police Division 20. Frank is in the photo, and this is taken at Camp Whitney, which is at the muster field. And we have a postcard of Camp Whitney. Camp Whitney, which was a muster field, extended from the area near the courthouse on Concord Street all the way to the State Police Barracks on Route 9. Over 200 years ago, the area was designated by the state as an area for encampments and training grounds and named the muster field. And during World War I, the 5th and 9th regiments of the National Guard were reorganized and formed into the 101st Regiment of the U.S. Army. And they trained there and at Camp Devens. Now we're getting into the Jordan side. We have the Harringtons and my paternal family. This is my great-grandmother Alice McConville Jordan with her boys, and the other ones later that we'll talk about as soldiers. My grandfather William is over on the right, and then his brother Joe, and then John Jordan. So Alice McConville was born in Portadown, County Armagh, Northern Ireland in 1860. She told her grandchildren of her life growing up in a land of turmoil in Northern Ireland. My mother loved and adored her grandmother and loved listening to her stories. Alice immigrated to and settled in the north end of Boston with her sister Jenny around 1882. And the two sisters met and married two brothers, William Jeremiah Jordan and John Henry Jordan, respectively. After their first son, William James, was born at 3 Thatcher Street, which is right near Charlestown, in the north end. Alice and William Jeremiah rented a house in Ashland and then Framingham until they finally bought a house on Pine and Hayes Street where they stayed for the rest of their lives. They had 3 more children, Joseph, John, and Mary, and Alice earned her U.S. citizenship in 1892 through her husband earning his. In those days, the women got their citizenship through their husbands. She didn't have to go and apply herself. Even though the family was, she earned money by stringing tags for Dennison to put on clothing, to sell clothing, and a lot of women in Framingham did home jobs to make extra money by stringing tags onto for the Dennison manufacturing. Even though the family was registered at St. Stephen's Church, they became close to Father Maskey when he established St. Tessicia's Church. And because the church was around the corner, Alice walked to Mass every morning. I can't imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been during World War I to have all 3 of her sons and her nephew on the front in Europe. She was active in fundraising activities and knitting for the troops. In 1932, she did travel back to Ireland with her daughter to see their family, and she re-entered through New York City and got to see the Statue of Liberty. And my mother would say, she bragged, "I saw the Statue of Liberty with me own eyes." In addition, she belonged to many religious organizations. She was a member of the James J. McGrath Unit 74, American Legion Auxiliary and Yankee Division Auxiliary in Boston. She passed away on June 10, 1935 at 75. This is William Jeremiah, my great-grandfather, Jordan, and he was born in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. He was baptized in the parish of Glenari and Killied on May 15th, 1859. However, his citizenship papers say he was born 2 months later, in July 1859. Well, how could that be? Well, I learned in genealogy classes that you had to register a new baby. In most European countries, you have to register the baby's birth. And in Ireland especially, you were fined if you didn't go in on the day they were born. Well, people didn't get to the town hall in those days. So in Ireland, they lied when they registered the baby. So when they finally registered him, he was 2 months old. But so that became his official birthday, even though he'd been baptized 2 months before that. So it's, I have Italian neighbors here, and they have the same thing. They have 2 different birthdays, their real birth and their registered birth. They have to go by the registered birth. William was the oldest of 6 children. When his father passed away, his mother took them to Scotland to live with an uncle whose surname was McFarlane. When he emigrated from Scotland with his brother John, they left from Edinburgh, and many of his descendants still live in Scotland today. He and John worked in New York City for several years when they finally moved to Boston and met and married the McConville sisters, and he became a U.S. citizen October 24, 1892. In 1896, he was hired by the Metropolitan Water Works and was in charge of the reservoirs in Framingham, a job he kept for 44 years. After settling in Framingham, he walked in all kinds of weather, from Hayes Street to the Winter Street waterfall, to regulate the dam. Didn't matter what weather it was, he always had to go up there and do that. He became a very close friend of Father Maskey's and helped raise money for the bell, and his name is engraved in the bell at St. Assisius Church. They let him in, I guess, the Irish. Great-grandpa was deeply devoted to his family and his country, and proud to have his sons and nephew in the military, and I'll refer to an interview of him later during the war. When Alice passed away in 1935, he purchased a large family lot at the top of the hill in St. Stephen's Cemetery, and all of his family is buried with him now. He was 74, he died in 1938. This is Uncle Joe. He was born in Ashland on June 10, 1894. He was the second son. He completed 1 year of high school and worked for the Adams Express Company. During World War I, he enlisted in the 35th Massachusetts Balloon Company and trained at Fort Wise, Texas, named for John Wise, who had been instrumental in perfecting ballooning. According to the research I've done, Joe's division was one of the only ones that saw action in France, even though they shipped all of the balloon divisions over there. Only some saw action. Ballooning was first used in the U.S. by the Union Army to spy on the Confederates during the Civil War. During World War I, they had chains tethered to balloons to create like a fence of chains to block any aircraft from banging into the spy balloons that we had. So then the men were, from a winch truck, raised up behind the metal fence, and they spied, and they actually had parachutes because they were sitting ducks up there. And then after they spied, they were lowered quickly down. Later on, I'll read a letter from him. His thank you note's quite interesting. And one point of interest, my mother had worked on family history and couldn't find him, his birth certificate. She didn't know they had lived in Ashland. So when I went into the New England Genealogy Society on 99 Newbury Street, the staff helped me, and she said, let's flip his name around. So they looked up Jeremiah Joseph, and he popped right up. So when you're doing genealogy, use initials, change names, and you might find them up, match them up to the family members. This is my Uncle John in the middle. He was born on Maple Street over here, February 8, 1896. He completed a freshman year at Framingham High and went to work for Adams Express. He joined the National Guard before World War I and helped train troops at Camp Whitney, and he was in the expedition led by General John Pershing to Mexico to pursue Pancho Villa. The expedition ended when the U.S. entered World War I and General Pershing was called back from Mexico. The National Defense Act of 1916 created a way to mobilize the National Guard outside of the U.S. borders. Men were required then to serve in both their state and for the federal government. The law helped funding for better equipment and increased training for the National Guard, and soldiers actually got better benefits also. On July 18, 1917, 3 months after the United States entered World War I, the 26th Infantry Division was constituted, and it was nicknamed the Yankee Division because most of the recruits were from New England. So that's the group that he was with. This is their sister Mary on the right. My grandmother's on the left. Great Aunt Mary was the youngest sister. She was born on Hayes Street, August 10, 1900. She was the only child in the family to complete 4 years of high school and 4 years of college. She was 17 when her brothers were away at school, in high school. She helped her mother knit items for the soldiers and participated in fundraisers, but I haven't found them in the military girls. They both joined the Women's Yankee Division Auxiliary and James J. McGrath Post and worked through the veterans organizations. Mary taught school in Boston for more than 40 years and died in 1983 at the age of 82. This is my grandfather, William Jordan. He was born August 3rd, 1892 on Thatcher Street in Boston. He was the oldest of the 4 boys, and according to census reports, he did have 1 year of high school. And the census reports have different information on all of them. And most of them just say, can read or can write. But I finally found one that said how many years of high school or college. And I found out that the boys only had 1 year of high school. But the sister did go through 4 years. So you can look for information for different things on census reports. He worked for the Adams Express Company when he got out of school. So I looked that up, and it was started in 1939 by Alvin Adams to protect and transport small packages, valuables, and letters between Worcester and Boston. And according to Wikipedia, it's still in existence and it's nationwide now. But it started here. And we do have photos of him training at Camp Whitney and at Devon's. This is the article from the scrapbook. On October 5th, 1917, a parade was led by the 5th Regiment Band for 22 men from 5 towns who had enlisted in the National Army and were leaving for training at Camp Devon's. Hundreds of townspeople lined the streets along Union Ave, Concord Square to Irving Square and back, and the parade ended at the high school grounds where a moving speech was delivered by Mr. John Merriman, who had 2 sons already serving. And Camp Devon's, located in Ayr and Shirley, was established September 5th, 1917 as a temporary camp for training soldiers of the 12th, 26th, and 76th Divisions of the Guards. And it was supposed to be temporary, but we know that it wasn't. I don't know if anyone knows, this was the high school right before they built the big high school. It's over here, but I don't know what building it would have been. We'll have to look that up. Because the high school that was Danforth Museum was built in the 1920s. So where the grounds of the high school were, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows.
Fred? Where's Fred?
Yes, the high school was on the same plot where the Jonathan Manor is today.
Oh. Up here?
It was moved over to the
Gordon?
Center.
The Gordon buildings?
Worcester Road.
Okay.
It's the Cobalt
Gordon.
Baker.
Couple blocks from here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Got it. So they must
So
have
they
marched
have
up
one
here.
march.
They came all the way up and figured it out then. Okay. And the military girls? Huh? Did I skip some? Oh, lunch with Mrs. Brown? I didn't see that. Oh, good job. The military girls are still busy. A most interesting meeting of the summer was held at the home of Mrs. John Bradley. Oh, I didn't know that part. In Natick, where many ideas were exchanged, names were drawn for the glad-to-get boxes, and they were Fred Canarney and Private George Clotter. Dainty refreshments were served, and a music program was enjoyed by all. I didn't realize we had the picture. The Red Cross dance. The military girls were working diligently on committee preparing for a Red Cross dance held on June 20th, 1918 at Washacom Park. Ruth Ann's grandfather, Mr. Bowen, would lead the 7-piece orchestra. With a price of admission of 35 cents, the club expected a goodly sum to be realized. Thank you notes were received from Ensign F.W. Dunning and John J. Jordan. So I'm going to read you his thank you note. I'm going to put my glasses on because it's kind of interesting. He was still in training. To the military girls, it is with great pleasure that I acknowledge receipt of your letter and package. It was indeed very thoughtful of you to remember me so far away from home. I am writing this letter under the greatest of difficulties, as I am up in a balloon 4,000 feet in the air. I have stopped observing for a few moments to write to you. I have been up here since 8 o'clock and must stay until 12, making a 4-hour flight. It is very windy this morning, and the balloon basket is swinging to and fro. The weather conditions are very changeable here, and many of the boys have been ill, but I have been very fortunate in my flights. I have met only 2 Framingham boys since I've been here in Texas, Luke Pham, formerly of the American Express Company, and Harry Cole, who was a Boston and Albany conductor. I can only write a little at a time and stop until the basket is steady again. I must now close by extending my best wishes to all my Framingham friends, and once more thanking you, the military girls. I remain sincerely yours, Joseph J. Jordan, May 21st, 1918. He hadn't gone over to Europe yet. And that's his thank you. Comfort Day. The military girls stationed themselves around Framingham and the Gorman and Princess Theaters, selling Comfort Day tags and white daisies. They exhausted their supplies, raising $1,500 towards the $100,000 goal. An airplane was supposed to land in Framingham as a treat, but was unable to fly in due to unfavorable weather conditions. The evening activities culminated with entertainment by the Army Band and patriotic speeches. So they had sold tags and daisies, and they were little tags they gave out around. Is that my grandmother? I can't tell. The military girls send delicacies. The military girls met at the homes of Mrs. Florence and Lillian Kelly on Mansfield Street. They enjoyed readings along with piano and Victrola selections. Members were served delightful repast of cake, coffee, fruit, and candy. A note was received from William Jordan thanking the girls for their delicacies that they had sent him up to Camp Devens. The military girls gave $5 to the Comfort Fund. The girls met at the home of Mrs. Harry Thompson on Hollis Street to discuss important affairs. They voted to donate $5 to the Comfort Fund. The name of George Martin was drawn to receive a Glad to Get box. Thank you letters were received from Walter Brogy and Joseph Harrington. The photo is of Club President Alice Fair. When the men arrived overseas, they sent postcards home. So these are the postcards that my great-grandparents received when William Jordan arrived in Europe. This is the interview of my great-grandfather when all 3 boys and the nephew were in service, and their nephew lived with them. His family was still in Ireland, so he was like another son to them. 7 in a family getting behind the government. 4 fighters, 2 knitters, and 1 turning his wages into 3 most subtle of fighters, Liberty Bonds. That was the record of one Framingham family. 3 of the 4 boys are now doing their bits in France at this moment, and the 4th is in Texas training, and Goldwood has just had a bit more training. The patriotic family hails from Framingham, and Mr. William Jordan of 28 Hayes Street, Framingham, who was the father of 3 of the boys and uncle of the 4th, has hung up the largest private service flag of all the neighborhood, and justly proud of the record made of his family. Nearly every branch of the Army is represented: ammunition train, engineers, infantry, and air service. It was a little disappointing not to be able to have another in the Marines, meaning him. But Mr. Jordan was a bit too old to be admitted to the corps himself, so he didn't have any more sons. So he felt that rooting all the support he could give was the most important branch. The 4 boys in the service were Sergeant William Jordan, G Company, 301st Ammunition, AEF, Joseph Jordan, 35th Balloon Country, John Wise, Texas, Bugler, John J. Jordan, 101st U.S. Infantry, AEF, and Mr. Jordan's nephew, Matthew Doran, L Company, 22nd U.S. Engineers, AEF. Mrs. Jordan and Mary, sister of the 3 soldiers, were knitting for the Red Cross. Before entering the Army, all 4 boys worked for Adams Express Company. Letters from the boys in France have been very cheerful and optimistic, And one letter from John, who has been gassed several times during the recent big push and counter-push, said, "We're killing them so fast, I don't believe there'll be any Huns left by New Year's." So you realize they called them Huns, not, Germans. From the scrapbook. All Framingham celebrates peace. At 2:57 a.m., official word was received. The following special calls for the Boy Scouts and Company 1 State Guard. The pre-arranged 10-10-10 alarm was sounded for the fire signal system, heralding the news to all of Framingham. So they knew that the war was ending, and they were ready for it. And when they were signing it in Europe, over here it was the middle of the night, I guess, and they had the sign. So all of a sudden, almost immediately, lights went on in all the homes. People started turning out into the streets. Locomotive whistles shrieked, factory whistles took up the tidings, church bells pealed forth, automobiles honked and honked and honked, and young Americans made themselves evident with tin and paper horns. Impromptu parades were organized all over town. Bands played, and clubs joined in with a celebration that lasted until noon. It gives one the chills to think about the happiness that spread all the way across this country. So that was in the middle of the night, but it was good news. So my grandfather arrived back in Hoboken, and this is the card, and he actually sent this one to my grandmother, and that he had come safely into harbor into the U.S. And this is an article. He arrived on a ship called the Mongolia, and I'm going to read the article because it was in the Post, which I'm not sure which Post it was, but it was down in New Jersey or Washington or New York. Hub boys arrive on the Mongolia. Over 300 New England soldiers on the big troop ship. New York, January 30th, Flatfoot Pham. The name and place means more to 300 Boston and New England soldiers who arrived tonight aboard the transport Mongolia from France than all the battles of war from Chelsea to Sedan. Flatfoot Pham were the first words those boys shouted from the big transport, carrying nearly 5,000 wounded soldiers, tied up at the dock in Hoboken shortly before 6 o'clock tonight. The name Pham was the last utterance the Post reporter heard as he left them several hours later. Tell the folks at home about us, they insisted, how we survived and how we can live through anything now. They all tell this story. The story was told by nearly every one of the 200 New England boys who arrived. If anyone didn't tell one thing about it to the reporter, it was because he couldn't handle making himself heard above the din of the others. The Pham was the billet to which the sick and wounded and convalescents were sent. So they called themselves, because Flatfoot was one of the terms for the soldiers. The U.S. Mongolia started out as a cruise ship. It was transformed into a warship and then eventually became a hospital ship. And it arrived here bringing soldiers and sick home. This was fun. While heading to Camp Devens, the troop train slowed as it made its way through the cheering crowds at the Framingham station. Corporal Frank Fair's father jumped on the train to tell him that his sisters Helen Bowen and Isobel Bradley were in the crowd. Frank jumped from the train, hugged them. In shock, they laughed and cried as he jumped back on the back of the train as it was headed out of town. We can only imagine the excitement and the relief. Of course, today, if we had cell phones, we'd have a video of the whole thing. But in our minds, I think it's even better. The excitement over the end of the war was tempered by a pandemic labeled the Spanish flu, which killed over 50 million people worldwide, predominantly young adults. It caused massive hemorrhaging and edema of the lungs. The movement of refugees and soldiers during the war helped to spread the disease. Soldiers in trenches who became very ill were transported on crowded trains to field hospitals, making matters worse. Ralph Newton mentioned in his thank you about the terrible conditions of the soldiers living in deep mud in the trenches, so you can imagine the disease that spread. The disease entered our country on September 8, 1918 via military personnel traveling to Camp Devens. Margaret Sullavan, a resident of Framingham and graduate of Framingham Nursing School in 1910, enlisted as an Army nurse in the Army Nurses Corps on August 1918. She was assigned to Camp Devens and was the first nurse to die of the flu 1 month later. 2 of her sisters died from the flu after visiting her, and other members of the family who were affected did survive. So 3 members in 1 month were lost because she went to help. It's really sad. U.S. Naval Seaman John Brennan, resident of Framingham, cousin to Mary Ellen Maury's dad, Mary Ellen. He died of the flu at Newport Naval Hospital on December 10, 1918. He was the brother of Jane and Elsie Brennan, who attended to him. Luckily, they did not get the disease. One of the later articles of the military girls mentioned that the large social gatherings were disbanded due to the flu, and club members met in small groups rather than having socials. The military girls donated $10 to a group of women in town who made bags of goodies to be passed out on the trains by the Boy Scouts. The military girls entrusted flowers to one officer on the train to bring to the sick wards at Camp Devens. So they had all kinds of bags of goodies, and they mentioned in the article that they even had donuts in the bags, and the Boy Scouts never touched them. They passed them out. So now we have fun times. These are pictures of my grandparents and their engagement picture in 1918, and their wedding on June 30th, 1920, and they eventually purchased a house at 3234 Hayes Street where they raised 4 children. My grandfather worked for the freight house for Boston Army Railroad. This was the 2nd railroad station, and they moved it when they built the Richardson station that's there now. And he was the supervisor there for all of his life. And this is Bill and the warehouse, the freight house guys. He's on the left side. And I don't have names on there. I wish I did. I don't know who the others are. But they were the guys from the freight house. After World War I, the 76th Division was demobilized. 743 soldiers, including Negroes from the 49th Company, were given honorable discharges. However, on June 24th, 1921, the 76th was reorganized under the U.S. Army Reserves. So they had disbanded it, but I thought it was interesting. It's very hard to read, but at the bottom it talked about the separate unit of Negro soldiers who were also part of the 76th. And they were all given honorable discharges, but then they reorganized again. And I used a magnifying glass to type that up, but that's basically what it talks about. Now in 1933, the military girls had a reunion, and because most of the women were married, they used their husband's names. So we're trying to match up people and see if any of you know anybody that was in the list that was in the original club. I hope that there are some that we do know, that I personally know and other people know, but some moved away, and we don't know who they all were. So Agnes Harrington on your right married John Looby of Milford. They had one daughter, Mary Louise, who's here. She was very active in Catholic women's clubs and director of the District Nurses Association. She enjoyed her 9 grandchildren, and she passed away on July 10th, 1970 at 75. On the right is Sister Placida Reedy Harrington. She entered St. Joseph Novitiate August 22nd, 1922, took the name Sister Mary Placida. She worked at the Randolph School for the Deaf for many years, and then Our Ladies at Newton. She taught 4th grade there. And she was kind of the glue that held the whole big Harrington family together. She retired at Bethany Convent, where she was able to spend more time with my grandmother, which was nice. Sister Placida died on January 9th, 1979 at 82. And that's one of my grandmother's birthday parties. Alice Fair and Isobel Fair, and I call them the spunky ladies. In 1934, Alice and her sister Isabel partnered to buy a guest house called the Homestead on the Bay in Onset. At ages 54 and 51 respectively, the 2 sisters purchased land in Wallingford, Connecticut, and built an 8,500 square foot Howard Johnson's restaurant. It cost $50,000, but with a prime location, on the route between New Haven and Hartford before 91 was built, they were able to pay off that mortgage in 1 year. Now that's a lot. That's like 1952. That's a lot of money. And Cassie Joiner talked about going to visit her dear friend Alice down at the Howard Johnson's. Alice passed away in 1969 at 84. Isobel stayed innkeeper with her and restaurateur, and she passed away in 1967 at 79. And this is the model of the Howard Johnsons that they had. The family does not have a picture of their restaurant, so this was what they had owned. Helen Bowen. She remained a homemaker after her marriage and raised 4 children, including Ruth Ann's mother, Ruth, Virginia, Walter, and Frances. She passed away in 1971 at 76. And Loretta Fair remained single and worked at Ashland Chemical Company and passed away at the age of 75. So they all stayed in the area and kept busy. Frank rose to the rank of corporal. Frank and his brothers Ralph and James owned Fair Oil and Ice Company on Nipmuc Ave near Washington Beach. Their brother Charles owned a shoe store downtown Framingham across from the railroad station. Frank married Grace Chickering of Hopkinton and had 4 children, John, Ralph, Frank, which they called Richie, and Betty. And Betty is here with us. Frank passed away in 1943 at the age of 51. And this is a slip from their oil company. Joe Jordan, a balloonist. Joe was a lifelong resident of Framingham. He worked at the American and Railway Express as a messenger for the rest of his life. In September 1922, he married Elizabeth Reardon from Lawrence. He remained active as a member of James J. McGrath Post, American Legion, Post 929, and Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Framingham Lodge at Elks. He passed away at 58 on April 27, 1952. And I have to tell you about my Uncle John because he was very active in the town. And this cartoon is about him. John Walton was Silver Star for bravery. He was the bugler in the Battle of Chateau Thierry. He also became a corporal. He returned to Framingham, worked at Denison Manufacturing for 14 years, and then for 25 years with the U.S. Labor Department, supervising the wage and hour division throughout New England. He married Edna Fields in 1927. In the summer, they operated a rooming house called the Methuen right at Hampton Beach, and we used to go up in the summer and visit them and go to the beach. In 1937, they were given a huge bon voyage party by all the townspeople and the selectmen and everyone in town at the Kendall Hotel before they went to Europe because he represented the American Legion Convention in Paris on their 20th anniversary. During World War II, he was assigned the Framingham Civil Defense Deputy Director, and he drove around in his big Buick with a siren attached to the side of it, conducting air raids. And the cartoon talks about making a slingshot for John Jordan, because if you don't put your lights out and put your black shades down, he's going to put them out for you. Sadly, Edna passed away on their 26th anniversary, and 5 years later he married Eleanor Burke, and we all stayed close to them. Throughout his life, he was active in town politics, a town meeting member, acting town moderator, member of the Finance Committee, Capitol Building Committee, and Board of Public Works. He actually resigned from the Public Works at 88 when he was ill. He represented the veterans in constructing the memorial building, and while on the school committee, he helped to plan the construction of Brophy School, and his name is on the plaque in the lobby at Brophy School. He remained very active in the veterans group in town and was often the commander. He was funny, loyal, and a caring member of our family and of our town. He passed away November 3rd, 1984 at 88. My grandpa. Bill Jordan remained active in the Veterans Organization and was past commander of Walter Garnett Post 261 of the American Legion of Boston. He was a member of societies at St. Stephen's Church, and when he passed away, he was the Grand Knight, Coeur d'Lion Council 87 of the Knights of Columbus. Bill and Cassie raised their 4 children, and in the 1940s, they traveled cross-country by train. He was still employed at the Boston and Albany Railroad as a supervisor of the freight house when he died suddenly of spinal meningitis on February 23rd, 1951, at the age of 58. And that day, 2 prominent Framingham men passed away on the same day, and they had an article about both of them. Let's see it again. Worked at the dentist. It took several years for my grandmother to adjust to losing my grandfather, but in time she did visit. Her daughter Marie lived out in California, and she used to visit Robert and his family. My Uncle Robert worked in embassies around the world, and she especially enjoyed her stay in Italy, where she saw many historic sites while she stayed with them. This is the last photo of Cassie and my family, her children. She was proud of their service in World War II. All 4 of them served. Marie, on the left, was a United States Air Force flight nurse. Bill Jr., on the left, was in the U.S. Army in Europe right at the end of the war. Robert, on the right, who worked in the embassies and is still living in Silver Spring, was assigned to guard the Panama Canal, which I thought was interesting. My mother served in the Naval Nurses Corps at Portsmouth Naval Yard and in Newport, where she worked in a special burn victim unit. Eventually, she became a Framingham public school nurse. And what a lot of people don't know is the first school nurses in Framingham in the 50s and 60s were almost all veterans of World War II. So as a wrap-up, my grandmother lived at a time when there were major changes on Earth. She grew up on Route 16 in Mendon, the main route from Milford to Rhode Island, which was a dirt road. Fire trucks would by in the summer, spraying the road to control the dust. Only one neighbor had a telephone, and the Harringtons could use it only on a limited basis. And years later, she would fly in a plane across the ocean. And she owned a television set on which she saw a man walk on the moon. So when you think about the changes in her lifetime. However, she also lived through World War I when her fiancé was serving overseas. And after the war, she lost dear friends in the pandemic. She and Belle managed to keep their home during the Great Depression while watching others lose theirs. During World War II, she also worried as her 4 children served in the military. Yet along with family and friends and others of her generation, she persevered. One of her most famous sayings, and I realized this as I did this work, is, "It's a great life if you don't weaken." My grandmother was alert until she passed away at age 93 on July 21st, 1983. I was holding her hands and I said, "Oh, Grandma, your hands are cold." And her last words were, "Cold hands, warm heart." So, that's my talk. Questions, but I know my mother-in-law's been trying to think of trick questions for about a month.